when the new Harvard graduate doctor humiliated me in front of everyone, calling me a clumsy intern. I didn't say a single word. I just smiled. Because 10 minutes later, in the chief physician's office, while he was signing that complaint form, he had no idea he was actually signing the death warrant of his own career. Watching the arrogance on his face turn to pure fear when the doors opened was priceless. But that wasn't the real shock. When the billionaire woman on the stretcher opened her eyes and looked at me, the ground beneath us shook. Justice is sometimes late, but when it arrives with a bang. You won't believe what happened next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so you don't miss out on these incredible stories. Now let's go back to that fateful morning. The Phoenix heat that morning was intense enough to melt the asphalt outside, but the air inside the emergency room was even more suffocating. I'm Julia Marston. I am 34 years old, and for exactly 12 years I have stood guard in these hospital corridors, right on the thin line between life and death. My team calls me the storm breaker because no one has ever seen my hands shake, even in the most chaotic moments. But that morning, someone walked in and shifted the balance immediately. Dr. Connor Blake. He was 32, handsome, but the arrogance he wore on his face was bigger than his diploma. He didn't need to find an opportunity to mention he was a Harvard graduate. His attitude screamed, "You are all beneath me." Within his first hour, he had scolded the nurses and even tried to lecture the senior doctors, and inevitably, he put me in his crosshairs. A call came in from Trauma Room 3. An elderly man needed an IV line urgently, and his condition was critical. I entered the room, put on my gloves, and with the reflexes of years of experience, I approached the patient's arm at the perfect angle. Just as I was about to insert the needle, that cold, humiliating voice thundered from behind me. "Stop! What do you think you are doing?" When I turned my head, Dr. Connor was looming over me. He slammed his tablet onto the counter and pointed a finger at my face, shouting for everyone to hear. "Intern! You are holding that needle like a butcher. You are risking the patient's life. Step aside immediately and let the professionals work." The entire emergency room froze. Aside from the beeping of the monitors, there was dead silence. Despite my 12 years of experience, despite the thousands of lives I had saved, this man thought I was an intern. He looked me in the eye and pushed me away from the patient. I could see my colleagues looking at me in horror. I could have answered. I could have screamed who I was, but I didn't. I just took a deep breath, took off my gloves, and walked out of the room silently, because arguing with fools is just a waste of time. But Connor didn't stop. He was still yelling after me. "I am reporting this to the chief physician. Who hires these incompetent people?" Exactly 10 minutes later, that announcement was made over the hospital speakers. Nurse Julia Marston to the chief physician's office immediately. Walking down the corridor, I felt everyone's eyes on me, pitying looks, whispers. When I entered Chief Physician Dr. Evelyn Carter's office, she wasn't alone. 2 members of the hospital administration were waiting for me like a jury, and on the table lay the report Dr. Connor had furiously written in those 10 minutes. It was in a red folder. That meant a request for immediate termination. Dr. Evelyn looked at me over her glasses and said, "Julia, Dr. Connor claims you endangered a patient and lack knowledge of medical procedures. This is a very serious accusation." Just as I was about to defend myself, to not let 12 years of hard work be destroyed by a piece of paper, the office door burst open. A stretcher was rushed in. This wasn't standard procedure. Emergency cases didn't come here. But the person on the stretcher wasn't a standard patient. It was Margaret Holloway, the real estate queen of Arizona and the hospital's biggest donor, covered in blood. Connor ran in beside her, breathless, shouting, "We need to intervene now. It's not sterile here, but there is no time." And then a miracle happened. Margaret, in her semi-conscious state, refused to let Connor touch her. She raised a trembling hand, pushed Connor away, and reached out toward the corner of the room, toward me, the nurse he thought was an intern. There was a glimmer in her eyes that only I could understand. She whispered, "It's not him. It's you. You saved me from death years ago. It's you again." The air in the room was suddenly sucked out. Chief Physician Evelyn stood up abruptly. Dr. Connor's face turned as white as a sheet. Margaret Holloway held my hand and pressed it to her chest. She pressed something into my palm, something cold and metal, and her final words were enough to end Connor's career right there and then. "Tell them, Julia. Tell them the truth." Margaret's hand went limp in mine and her eyes closed again, but that cold metal object she pressed into my palm felt like it was burning through my skin. I opened my hand slowly and saw a small golden key with an engraved number on it. But before I could process what it meant, the monitors started screaming and Margaret's blood pressure dropped, dangerously low. Dr. Evelyn immediately shifted into emergency mode and ordered everyone to move her to the ICU, but Margaret's fingers were still wrapped around my wrist and she wouldn't let go. Connor tried to step forward again with that same arrogant tone, saying he would take over the case since he was the attending physician. But Chief Physician Evelyn stopped him with a single look that could have frozen fire and told him to wait outside until further notice. The way his jaw clenched and the veins in his neck bulged told me he knew something had shifted, but he had no idea how much. As they wheeled Margaret out, she opened her eyes one more time, looked directly at me, and whispered something that made my heart stop. "The file is in the safe, Julia, the one only you can open, and it will destroy everyone who tried to bury the truth." The door closed behind the stretcher, and suddenly it was just me, Dr. Evelyn, and the two stony-faced administrators in that suffocating office. The red folder with Connor's report sat on the desk like a ticking bomb, but now it seemed almost laughable compared to what had just happened. Dr. Evelyn picked up the folder, looked at it for a long moment, then slowly tore it in half and dropped it into the trash bin without breaking eye contact with me. She sat down, folded her hands on the desk, and asked me in a voice that was equal parts curious and concerned what Margaret meant by those words and what file she was talking about. I told her I honestly didn't know, which was the truth, but the key in my hand felt heavier with every passing second, and I knew that whatever was in that safe was going to change everything. One of the administrators, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Mr. Pemberton, cleared his throat and reminded everyone that Margaret Holloway was not just any patient. She was the woman who had donated $15 million to build the new pediatric wing. And if anything happened to her, or if she made any complaints about the hospital's treatment, the board of directors would have everyone's heads on a platter. Dr. Evelyn nodded slowly and told me to sit down because we needed to talk about what happened 7 years ago, the incident that Margaret was referring to, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what she meant. It was the night that had changed my life forever, the night I wasn't supposed to talk about, the night that had been buried under layers of legal paperwork and non-disclosure agreements. 7 years ago, Margaret Holloway had been brought into this very hospital after a car accident on the I-10, and she wasn't alone in that car. Her daughter, Emily, who was only 16 at the time, had been driving, and the accident had been caused by something that the Holloway family wanted desperately to keep quiet. I had been the lead nurse in the trauma bay that night, and I had seen things, heard things, and documented things that powerful people didn't want documented. Margaret had survived because I had caught a critical detail that the attending physician had missed, a small tear in her aorta that would have killed her within hours if left untreated. But Emily had not been so lucky. The girl had died on the operating table, despite everything we did, and the guilt and grief had nearly destroyed Margaret. But what really broke her was the cover-up that followed. The attending physician that night had been Dr. Richard Voss, who was now the head of surgery and one of the most powerful doctors in the hospital, and he had made a series of decisions that night that were questionable at best and criminally negligent at worst. He had prioritized Margaret's treatment over Emily's, even though Emily's injuries were more severe. And when I had questioned his decisions and tried to advocate for the girl, he had threatened my job and told me to stay in my lane. After Emily died, the Holloway family's lawyers had swarmed the hospital like vultures, and everyone involved had been forced to sign non-disclosure agreements that basically said we would never speak about what happened that night or face legal destruction. Margaret had been sedated and grief-stricken for weeks after the accident, and I don't think she ever really knew the full truth about the decisions that were made. But apparently she remembered me as the nurse who had fought for her and her daughter when no one else would. The hospital had paid the family a quiet settlement. Dr. Voss had been quietly promoted to keep him loyal and silent, and I had been given a small raise and a warning to never bring it up again. But now, 7 years later, Margaret was back in this hospital, and she was talking about a file and a safe and the truth. And I had a terrible feeling that whatever was locked away was going to blow the lid off everything. Dr. Evelyn must have been thinking the same thing because her face had gone pale, and she asked me directly if I had kept any records or notes from that night, anything that could be considered a violation of the NDA I had signed. I told her the truth, that I had followed the rules and kept my mouth shut for 7 years. But I also knew that other people in that trauma bay had seen what I saw. And if Margaret had evidence of what really happened, then there was nothing any of us could do to stop it from coming out. Mr. Pemberton stood up abruptly and said this conversation needed to involve the hospital's legal team immediately. But before he could leave, my pager went off with a code blue alert from the ICU. Margaret was crashing. I ran out of that office without waiting for permission, my feet pounding down the corridor as my mind raced through everything that had just happened and everything that was about to happen. When I burst through the ICU doors, the scene was pure chaos with doctors and nurses swarming around Margaret's bed, and I could see Dr. Voss himself standing at the head of the bed, barking orders with that same authoritative voice he had used 7 years ago when he let a 16-year-old girl die. He looked up when I entered, and our eyes met for just a split second, and in that moment I saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like fear, as if he knew that Margaret waking up and talking to me was the beginning of the end for him. The monitors were screaming and Margaret's heart rate was erratic, and one of the residents called out that she was in ventricular tachycardia, and they needed to shock her immediately. Dr. Voss grabbed the defibrillator paddles and charged them, but just as he was about to place them on Margaret's chest, her eyes flew open and she looked directly at me with a clarity that seemed impossible given her condition. And she said 5 words that made everyone in that room freeze. "Don't let him touch me." Dr. Voss stepped back like he'd been slapped, and the paddles hung uselessly in his hands as Margaret continued to stare at me with those fierce eyes that had built a billion-dollar empire and weren't about to let some corrupt doctor finish what he had started 7 years ago. I moved forward without thinking, my training kicking in as I checked her vitals and saw that her heart rhythm was actually stabilizing on its own, and I realized that this wasn't a true code blue at all, but rather a panic response, possibly triggered by seeing Dr. Voss standing over her. I spoke to her calmly, telling her that she was safe and that I was right here, and I watched as her breathing slowed and her heart rate came down, and the monitors gradually stopped screaming. The ICU staff stood around in stunned silence, and Dr. Voss looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words, and finally he just set down the defibrillator paddles and walked out without a single word to anyone. Once Margaret was stable, I stayed by her bedside while the other staff gradually filtered out, and when we were finally alone, she reached for my hand again and held it with surprising strength for someone who had just been at death's door. She told me that she needed to explain everything, that she had been carrying this burden for 7 years, and that she had tried to find me so many times. But the hospital and her lawyers had made it nearly impossible. After Emily died, Margaret had fallen into a deep depression and had been too broken to ask questions about what really happened that night. But as the years passed and the grief settled into something more manageable, she had started to wonder about the timeline of events and the decisions that were made. She had hired private investigators who had dug into the medical records, and what they found had been enough to make her physically ill. Dr. Voss had made a calculated decision to prioritize her treatment over Emily's because Margaret was the one with money and power and connections, while Emily was just a teenager who had made a mistake by driving too fast on a wet road. The investigators had found documentation showing that Emily could have been saved if she had been taken to surgery immediately, but instead she had been left waiting while Dr. Voss focused all his attention and the best surgical team on Margaret. Margaret's voice cracked as she told me this, and tears rolled down her face as she said that she had essentially been saved at the cost of her own daughter's life, and the guilt was eating her alive. She had wanted to go public with what she had learned, to sue the hospital and destroy Dr. Voss's career, but her lawyers had advised her that the NDA she had signed was ironclad and that any attempt to speak out would result in her being sued for breach of contract and potentially losing everything. So she had stayed silent, but she had also been preparing, gathering evidence, and waiting for the right moment to bring everything into the light. The file she mentioned was in a safe deposit box at First National Bank downtown, and the key she had given me was the only way to access it. Inside that box was everything: copies of the original medical records before they were altered, witness statements from staff members who had been paid off or threatened into silence, and a full timeline of events that proved Dr. Voss had committed medical malpractice and the hospital had covered it up. I asked her why she was giving this to me, why she was putting this burden on my shoulders, and she said it was because I was the only person in that trauma bay 7 years ago who had tried to do the right thing. The only person who had fought for Emily when everyone else was worried about protecting themselves and the hospital's reputation. She said she trusted me to know what to do with the information and that whatever I decided, she would support me completely, even if it meant burning down the entire hospital administration in the process. I sat there holding her hand and feeling the weight of that key in my pocket, and I knew that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine. Margaret closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the emotional confession, and I quietly left the ICU with my mind spinning and my heart pounding. As I walked back through the hospital corridors, everything looked different, like I was seeing the place with new eyes and noticing all the cracks in the facade that I had been trained to ignore. I passed Dr. Voss's office and saw him through the window, sitting at his desk with his head in his hands, and I wondered if he knew that his world was about to come crashing down. I thought about Connor and his arrogant face and his stupid report, and I realized that he was just a symptom of a much bigger disease, a system that rewarded ego and protected the powerful while throwing people like me under the bus. When I finally made it back to the emergency department, the shift had changed and new faces were working the floor. But the story of what had happened with Margaret had already spread like wildfire, and people were looking at me with a mixture of awe and fear, like I had suddenly become someone dangerous and unpredictable. My friend Lisa, who had been working in the ER for almost as long as I had, pulled me aside into the med supply room and asked me what the hell was going on, and whether it was true that Margaret Holloway had publicly refused treatment from Dr. Voss. I told her it was complicated and that I couldn't talk about it yet, but her eyes were sharp and she could read me like a book, and she said that whatever I was planning, I needed to be careful because people like Dr. Voss and the hospital administration didn't fight fair, and they would destroy me if they felt threatened. I thanked her for the warning and told her I knew what I was doing, which was a complete lie because I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't back down now. The key in my pocket felt like it was burning a hole through my scrubs, and I knew that the moment I opened that safe deposit box and saw what was inside, there would be no turning back. That evening, I drove to First National Bank in downtown Phoenix, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white. And the whole way there, I kept thinking about what Margaret had said about burning down the hospital administration and whether I was really ready to be the person who lit that match. The bank was one of those old buildings with marble columns and high ceilings that made you feel small and insignificant. And when I walked up to the customer service desk and showed them the key, the woman behind the counter looked at it for a long moment before asking for my identification. I gave her my driver's license and held my breath, wondering if Margaret had actually put my name on the access list, or if this was all going to fall apart right here. But the woman typed something into her computer and nodded and told me to follow her to the vault in the basement. We walked down a narrow staircase that seemed to go on forever, and with each step, I felt like I was descending into something dark and dangerous that I wouldn't be able to climb back out of. The vault was cold and smelled like metal and old paper, and the woman led me to a small private room where she retrieved the safe deposit box and set it on the table in front of me before leaving me alone with instructions to ring the bell when I was finished. I sat there, staring at that box for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering in my chest, and then I finally opened it and saw what Margaret had been protecting all these years. Inside were 3 thick folders, each one labeled with dates and names, and as I started going through them, I felt sick to my stomach because the evidence was even worse than I had imagined. The first folder contained the original medical records from the night of the accident, and I could see clearly where someone had gone through and changed timestamps and altered notes to make it look like Emily had been treated immediately, when, in reality, she had been left waiting for almost 40 minutes while Dr. Voss worked on Margaret. There were handwritten notes from nurses who had been in the trauma bay that night, people I had worked alongside, describing how Dr. Voss had told them to focus all resources on Margaret and to keep Emily stable, but not to waste time on extensive interventions because her injuries were too severe. The second folder was even more damning because it contained copies of emails and text messages between Dr. Voss and the hospital administration in the days following Emily's death, and they were discussing how to manage the situation and control the narrative. There were messages from the hospital's legal team instructing Dr. Voss on exactly what to say in his official report and warning him not to deviate from the script. And there were messages from the CEO at the time talking about the importance of protecting the hospital's reputation and making sure the Holloway family was satisfied with the settlement so they wouldn't pursue a public lawsuit. Reading those messages made me feel physically ill because they were talking about a 16-year-old girl's death like it was a public relations problem that needed to be managed, not a tragedy that deserved justice and accountability. The third folder contained witness statements from 5 different staff members who had been in the trauma bay that night, and every single one of them described the same thing, that Dr. Voss had made a conscious decision to prioritize Margaret's treatment over Emily's, and that several people had objected but were told to follow orders or face termination. One of those witness statements was from Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who had been a resident at the time and was now a successful emergency physician at another hospital in Scottsdale. And her statement was particularly detailed because she had been the one advocating most strongly for Emily and had been pulled aside by Dr. Voss and threatened directly. She had written that Dr. Voss told her that if she ever spoke about what happened that night, he would make sure she never worked in medicine again, and that he had connections throughout the state medical board that would destroy her career before it even started. Reading her words, I remembered Patricia from that night, remembered how passionate and angry she had been, and how defeated she had looked when she finally stopped fighting and followed Dr. Voss's orders. I wondered if she knew that her statement was sitting in this safe deposit box, waiting to be used, or if she had spent the last 7 years thinking that her silence had protected her career, when in reality it had just protected the people who deserved to be exposed. At the bottom of the third folder was a handwritten letter from Margaret addressed to me, and when I unfolded it and started reading, I had to stop several times because the words were so raw and painful. She wrote about the night she finally understood what had really happened, about how she had been at home going through Emily's things and had found her daughter's journal. And in that journal, Emily had written about wanting to be a doctor someday and about how she admired the nurses and doctors who saved lives every day. Margaret wrote that reading those words had broken something inside her because she realized that her daughter had died in a place that should have saved her, surrounded by people who had the skills and knowledge to help her, but who had chosen not to because of politics and money and power. She wrote that she had tried to kill herself twice in the year after she learned the truth, that the guilt of being saved at her daughter's expense was too much to bear, but that eventually she had decided that the best way to honor Emily's memory was to make sure the truth came out and that no other family would ever have to go through what she had gone through. The letter ended with Margaret telling me that she knew this was an enormous burden to place on my shoulders, but that she believed I was strong enough to carry it and brave enough to do what was right, even when it was hard. She wrote that whatever I decided to do with this information, she would stand behind me completely, and that she had already spoken with her lawyers about the possibility of breaking the NDA, and had been told that if she could prove that the hospital had committed fraud by altering medical records, then the NDA would be void and she would be free to speak publicly. She ended the letter by saying that she hoped I could forgive her for dragging me into this mess, but that she couldn't think of anyone else she trusted more to see it through. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the folder, and then I sat there in that cold vault room trying to process everything I had just learned and trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I knew that if I took this evidence public, it would destroy Dr. Voss's career and potentially bring down several members of the hospital administration who had been involved in the cover-up, but it would also turn me into a target and make me persona non grata in the Phoenix medical community. I thought about all the years I had spent building my career and my reputation, all the late nights and double shifts and moments of crisis where I had proven myself over and over again, and I wondered if I was really willing to throw all of that away for the sake of a truth that most people probably didn't want to hear. But then I thought about Emily Holloway, a 16-year-old girl with dreams of becoming a doctor who had died because someone decided her life was worth less than her mother's money, and I knew that I didn't really have a choice. Some things are more important than career advancement and job security, and this was one of those things. I gathered all the folders and put them back in the box, then rang the bell for the bank employee to come back and lock everything up. As I walked out of that bank and into the warm Phoenix evening, I felt different, like I had crossed some invisible line and there was no going back. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at my phone and thinking about who I needed to call first. And finally, I decided that the first person who needed to know about this was Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the resident who had tried to fight for Emily 7 years ago and who deserved to know that her courage hadn't been forgotten. I found her contact information through the state medical directory and sent her a carefully worded email saying that I had been one of the nurses in the trauma bay the night Emily Holloway died, and that I had recently come into possession of information that she might want to know about, and that if she was willing to talk, I would very much like to speak with her. I drove home in a daze, barely paying attention to the traffic, and when I walked into my apartment, I collapsed on the couch and just sat there in the dark for hours, trying to wrap my mind around everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. This morning I had been just another emergency room nurse dealing with another arrogant new doctor, and now I was sitting on evidence that could bring down one of the most powerful physicians in Arizona and expose a conspiracy that had been hidden for 7 years. My phone buzzed with a text message from Lisa, asking if I was okay and reminding me that we had plans to get drinks tomorrow night, and I realized that I hadn't even thought about anything as normal as having drinks with a friend because my entire world had been turned upside down. I texted her back saying that I was fine, but that I might need to cancel our plans because something had come up, and she immediately called me instead of texting back, because that's the kind of friend she was. Lisa demanded to know what was going on and whether it had anything to do with Margaret Holloway and the scene in the ICU, and I knew I couldn't tell her everything yet because I needed to be strategic about how this information came out, but I also knew that I was going to need allies in the coming weeks and that Lisa was someone I could trust. So I told her a carefully edited version of the truth, that Margaret had given me information about something that happened years ago and that it involved Dr. Voss and the hospital administration, and that I was trying to figure out the best way to handle it. Lisa was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that made my blood run cold, which was that she had heard rumors over the years about Dr. Voss and some kind of incident involving a patient who died under suspicious circumstances, but that everyone who had been involved seemed too scared to talk about it, and that the whole thing had been buried so deep that most people didn't even know it had happened. She told me that if I was planning to go up against Dr. Voss, I needed to be prepared for the fact that he had powerful friends and that he wouldn't go down without a fight. And she also told me that I should probably talk to a lawyer before I did anything else because what I was dealing with could have serious legal implications. I thanked her for the advice and promised I would be careful, and after we hung up, I immediately started researching lawyers who specialized in medical malpractice and whistleblower cases. I found a firm in Phoenix that had a good reputation for taking on hospitals and medical institutions, and I sent them an email describing my situation in very general terms and asking if they would be willing to meet with me for a consultation. Within an hour, I got a response from one of the partners saying that they were very interested in hearing more and that they could meet with me first thing Monday morning. That weekend was the longest weekend of my life, and I spent most of it going over the folders from the safe deposit box again and again, memorizing every detail and trying to anticipate every possible question or challenge that might come up. I also spent a lot of time thinking about Connor and his ridiculous report, and I realized that in the grand scheme of things, his attempt to get me fired was actually the least of my problems right now. But it also occurred to me that his arrival at the hospital and his immediate antagonism toward me might not be a coincidence. I started to wonder if someone had known that Margaret was going to be brought back to this hospital and had arranged for Connor to be transferred here as a way of creating chaos and distraction. But then I realized I was probably being paranoid and that sometimes assholes are just assholes without any deeper conspiracy. On Sunday night, I got an email back from Dr. Patricia Hernandez, and my hands were shaking as I opened it because I had no idea how she was going to react to hearing from me after all these years. Her email was short but powerful, and she wrote that she had never forgotten that night and had spent years wondering if she should have done more to fight back against Dr. Voss's decisions, and that she would be willing to meet with me and discuss what I had found. We agreed to meet for coffee on Tuesday morning at a place halfway between Phoenix and Scottsdale, and as I sent the confirmation email, I felt a surge of hope, because for the first time in 7 years, someone else who had been there that night was willing to stand up and tell the truth. Monday morning, I called in sick to work, which I almost never did, but I needed to meet with the lawyers and I couldn't risk anyone at the hospital asking questions about where I was going. The law firm's offices were in a sleek high-rise in downtown Phoenix, and when I walked in, I was greeted by a paralegal who led me to a conference room where 2 attorneys were waiting for me. The senior partner was a woman in her 50s named Rebecca Winters, who had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in court, and her associate was a younger man named Marcus Chen, who specialized in medical malpractice cases. I spread out all the folders on the conference table and walked them through everything I had found, and I watched as their expressions changed from professional interest to genuine shock as they realized the scope of what they were looking at. Rebecca asked me a series of very pointed questions about how I had obtained this evidence and whether I had violated any laws or agreements in the process of getting it. And I explained about Margaret giving me the key and about the NDA I had signed 7 years ago, but that I had never actually disclosed anything myself, that Margaret was the one who had gathered all this information and who was willing to break her own NDA if it could be proven that the hospital had committed fraud. Marcus pulled out his laptop and started taking notes, and he told me that based on what he was seeing, there was definitely grounds for a lawsuit against both Dr. Voss personally and the hospital for medical malpractice, wrongful death, and fraud, and that the altered medical records alone would be enough to void any NDAs that had been signed because they proved that the hospital had been actively covering up evidence of a crime. Rebecca leaned back in her chair and looked at me with an expression that was hard to read, and then she said something that made my stomach drop, which was that if we moved forward with this case, my life was going to become incredibly difficult, and that I needed to be absolutely certain I was prepared for what was coming. She said that the hospital would fight back with everything they had, that they would try to discredit me and destroy my reputation, and that I would probably lose my job and potentially be blacklisted from working in other hospitals in the area. She said that whistleblowers almost never come out of these situations unscathed, and that even if we won the case, which she thought we could, the personal cost to me would be enormous. Marcus added that they would do everything in their power to protect me legally and to make sure I wasn't retaliated against, but that realistically, there was only so much they could do to shield me from the fallout. I sat there listening to them lay out all the ways this could go wrong, and I felt a moment of doubt where I wondered if maybe I should just put all those folders back in the safe deposit box and pretend I had never seen them. But then I thought about Emily Holloway and about all the other patients who might be harmed in the future if people like Dr. Voss were allowed to continue practicing medicine without accountability. And I knew that I had to move forward no matter what it cost me personally. I told Rebecca and Marcus that I understood the risks and that I wanted to proceed with the case, and I watched as they exchanged a look that seemed to say they had expected nothing less. Rebecca stood up and shook my hand and told me that she was proud to represent me and that we were going to make sure Emily Holloway got the justice she deserved, even if it was 7 years too late. As I left their office and walked back out into the bright Phoenix sunshine, I felt scared and exhilarated and absolutely certain that I had just made a decision that was going to change everything. The meeting with Dr. Patricia Hernandez on Tuesday morning felt like stepping back in time, because the moment I saw her walking into that coffee shop, I recognized the same fire in her eyes that I had seen 7 years ago when she had been fighting for Emily's life in that trauma bay. She was older now, more polished and confident, but there was still an edge of anger simmering just below the surface. And when we sat down across from each other with our coffee cups between us, she didn't waste any time with small talk. She looked me straight in the eye and asked me if what I had found was enough to finally bring Dr. Voss down. And when I nodded and started pulling out copies of the documents from my bag, I saw her hands start to shake slightly as she realized that this was really happening. She told me that she had spent the last 7 years trying to move past that night, that she had built a successful career and had tried to convince herself that there was nothing she could have done differently, but that the guilt had never really gone away, and she still had nightmares about Emily Holloway's face. As we went through the documents together, Patricia filled in details that weren't in the official records. Things she remembered from that night that had been deliberately left out of all the reports and statements. She told me that when Emily had first arrived in the trauma bay, her injuries had actually been very treatable, and that if they had taken her to surgery immediately, she would have had an excellent chance of survival, but that Dr. Voss had made a snap judgment based on who the patients were rather than on their medical conditions. She said that she had heard him say out loud that Margaret Holloway was their priority because she was important and had connections, and that Emily was just a kid who had been driving recklessly and had caused the accident in the first place, as if that somehow meant she deserved to die. Patricia's voice cracked when she told me this, and I could see tears forming in her eyes as she described how helpless she had felt watching a savable patient slowly deteriorate, while all the best resources were being used on someone else. She told me that after Emily died, Dr. Voss had called her into his office and had made it very clear that if she ever spoke about what happened, he would personally destroy her career before it even started, and that he had shown her a list of people on the state medical board who were his friends and who would back him up if it came down to his word against hers. She said that she had been terrified because she was just a resident with mountains of student debt and no real power or connections, and that she had made the calculation that staying silent was the only way to protect her future, but that the decision had haunted her ever since. Now, 7 years later, she was an established physician with her own reputation and her own resources, and she said that she was ready to tell the truth no matter what it cost her, because she owed it to Emily and to herself. I told her about the lawyers I had, met with and about their assessment that we had a strong case, and I asked her if she would be willing to give a formal statement and potentially testify if it came to a trial, and she agreed without hesitation. We spent another hour going over the details and making plans for how to coordinate with the legal team, and by the time we said goodbye in the parking lot, I felt like I had gained a powerful ally in what was going to be a very difficult fight. That afternoon, I went back to work for the first time since the incident with Margaret, and the atmosphere in the hospital was absolutely bizarre because everyone knew something major was happening, but nobody knew exactly what it was. I could feel people watching me as I walked through the corridors, and the whispers started up again the moment I passed by. But I kept my head up and my expression neutral because I couldn't let them see how anxious I was. When I got to the emergency department, my supervisor pulled me aside and told me that Dr. Evelyn wanted to see me again in her office, and my heart sank because I knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Dr. Evelyn's office felt even more oppressive than it had the first time, and when I walked in, she wasn't alone because sitting in the chairs across from her desk were Dr. Voss and two people I didn't recognize, but who looked like they were definitely lawyers based on their expensive suits and cold expressions. Dr. Evelyn gestured for me to sit down, and before I could even get settled, Dr. Voss started talking in that smooth, authoritative voice that probably worked well on juries and boards of directors, but just made my skin crawl. He said that he understood I had been through a very stressful experience with Margaret Holloway's emergency admission, and that he wanted to make sure I was doing okay mentally and emotionally, but the concern in his voice was so fake that it was almost insulting. He said that the hospital was prepared to offer me a generous mental health leave package and access to counseling services, and that they would fully support me if I needed some time away from work to recover. I looked at him and then at Dr. Evelyn and then at the two lawyers, and I realized that this wasn't about my well-being at all. This was about getting me out of the hospital and away from Margaret before I could cause any more problems. One of the lawyers, a severe-looking woman with steel gray hair, chimed in and said that the hospital was also prepared to offer me a financial settlement in recognition of the stress I had been under, and she slid a folder across the desk toward me that I didn't even need to open to know what was inside. It was another NDA, another attempt to buy my silence. And the fact that they were being this proactive told me that they knew Margaret had given me something important, and they were scrambling to contain the damage. I looked at that folder for a long moment, and then I pushed it back across the desk, without opening it, and told them that I didn't need time off and I didn't need counseling and I definitely didn't need their money, and that I was perfectly fine to continue doing my job. Dr. Voss's expression hardened immediately, and the mask of concern slipped enough for me to see the anger underneath, and he said that he was merely trying to look out for my best interests, and that it would be unfortunate if I made decisions that I might regret later. The threat was barely even veiled, and the two lawyers sat there stone-faced like they were used to watching their clients intimidate people into submission. But I had spent the last few days preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation, and I wasn't going to back down. I told Dr. Voss that I appreciated his concern, but that I was a professional with 12 years of experience, and I knew how to handle stress. And then I stood up and walked out of that office before any of them could say anything else. My hands were shaking as I walked back down the corridor, and I had to duck into a supply closet for a moment to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. But I also felt a surge of satisfaction because I had faced them down, and they knew now that I wasn't going to be easy to intimidate. The next few days were a blur of secret meetings with lawyers and conversations with Patricia, and trying to keep my head down at work while feeling like everyone was watching my every move. Rebecca Winters called me on Thursday afternoon to tell me that they had finished their initial analysis of the evidence and that they were ready to file a lawsuit against Dr. Voss and the hospital, but that before they did, they wanted to make sure I understood exactly what was going to happen once the papers were filed. She said that the hospital would immediately move to have me suspended or terminated, and that they would launch a full investigation into how I had obtained the evidence, and that my personal life would be picked apart by their legal team looking for anything they could use to discredit me. She said that the case could take years to resolve, and that I needed to be prepared for a long, exhausting fight, but that if we won, it would not only bring justice for Emily Holloway, but could also set a precedent that would make it harder for hospitals to cover up medical malpractice in the future. I told Rebecca that I understood and that I was ready to move forward, and we agreed that they would file the lawsuit on Monday morning, which gave me the weekend to prepare myself mentally for what was coming. That Friday evening, Lisa dragged me out for the drinks we'd been planning because she said I looked like I was about to collapse from stress, and I needed at least one night where I wasn't thinking about lawsuits and conspiracies. We went to our usual bar in Tempe, and for a few hours I actually managed to relax and laugh and feel like a normal person again. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about Monday and about how everything was going to change. Lisa could tell I was distracted, and eventually she put down her drink and asked me point blank what was really going on. And I realized that I owed her the truth because she had been my friend and ally for years, and she deserved to know what she was potentially going to get caught up in. So I told her everything about Emily Holloway and the cover-up and the evidence and the lawsuit that was about to be filed, and I watched her face go through a whole range of expressions, from shock to anger to fierce determination. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that made me want to cry, which was that she was proud of me for doing the right thing even though it was going to be incredibly hard, and that whatever happened, I wasn't going to face it alone because she had my back. She also told me something that I hadn't known, which was that she had heard other nurses over the years talking about Dr. Voss and how he had a pattern of making decisions based on politics and money rather than on medical necessity, and that there were probably other cases out there that hadn't been exposed yet. She said that if this lawsuit succeeded in bringing him down, it might encourage other people to come forward with their own stories, and that I might be starting something much bigger than I realized. That weekend, I tried to prepare myself for Monday, but there was really no way to prepare for something like this, so I just spent the time doing normal things like cleaning my apartment and going for long runs, and trying not to think too much about the fact that my entire life was about to be turned upside down. On Sunday evening, Margaret called me from her hospital room where she was still recovering, and her voice was stronger than it had been the last time I saw her, and she told me that her lawyers had confirmed that the NDA would be void once the lawsuit was filed, because the evidence of fraud invalidated the contract. She said that she had already drafted a public statement that she was planning to release to the media as soon as the lawsuit became public, and that she was going to use every ounce of her wealth and influence to make sure this case got the attention it deserved. She thanked me for being brave enough to carry this burden and for giving her the chance to finally get justice for Emily. And by the time we hung up, I was crying because the weight of what we were about to do felt almost unbearable. Monday morning arrived too quickly, and I woke up feeling like I was going to be sick, but I forced myself to get dressed and go to work because I wanted to be there when the news broke. Rebecca had told me that the lawsuit would be filed at 9 a.m. and that the hospital would probably be notified within the hour, and that I should expect to be called into Dr. Evelyn's office almost immediately. Sure enough, at 10:30, my supervisor found me in the middle of treating a patient and told me that I needed to go to the chief physician's office right away, and the look on her face told me that she knew something serious was happening. I finished stabilizing my patient and then walked through those familiar corridors one more time, knowing that this might be the last time I walked them as an employee of this hospital. And when I entered Dr. Evelyn's office, the scene was exactly what I had expected. Dr. Voss was there looking absolutely livid, and the two lawyers from before were there looking grim, and Dr. Evelyn herself looked tired and defeated, like she knew this was a battle she couldn't win. One of the lawyers, the severe woman with gray hair, stood up and informed me that I was being placed on immediate administrative leave, pending an investigation into how I had obtained confidential patient information and whether I had violated hospital policy and federal privacy laws. I had been prepared for this, and my own lawyer had coached me on exactly what to say, so I simply responded that I had not violated any laws or policies, and that any evidence in the lawsuit had been obtained legally through proper channels, and that if they had any further questions, they should direct them to my legal representation. I handed them Rebecca Winter's business card, and I watched Dr. Voss's face turn an even deeper shade of red as he realized that I had come prepared for this fight. Dr. Evelyn asked me to turn in my badge and my key card, and there was something almost apologetic in her eyes as she said it, like she knew that what was happening to me wasn't fair, but that she had no choice but to follow the hospital's legal strategy. I unclipped my badge from my scrubs and set it on her desk along with my key card, and as I walked out of that office for what I thought might be the last time, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with terror, because the waiting was finally over, and now the real battle could begin. I walked through the emergency department one last time, and Lisa saw me and immediately knew what had happened, and she grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard and whispered that she would call me later. I nodded and kept walking, past all the curious faces and whispered conversations, and out through the main entrance into the blindingly bright Arizona sunshine. The next few weeks were absolutely brutal, and there were days when I seriously questioned whether I had made the right decision because the personal cost was even higher than Rebecca had warned me it would be. The hospital's legal team launched an aggressive smear campaign against me, leaking carefully worded statements to the media that painted me as a disgruntled employee with a history of insubordination who had stolen confidential patient information for personal gain. And suddenly, my face was all over the local news and social media, with people I had never met calling me a liar and a criminal. The hospital claimed that I had violated HIPAA regulations by accessing Margaret's medical records without authorization, which was completely false because Margaret had given me explicit permission and had signed legal documents saying so, but the damage to my reputation was done before the truth could catch up. But the hospital made a critical mistake in their strategy, because in their rush to discredit me, they forgot about Dr. Patricia Hernandez and the fact that she was also willing to testify about what had happened that night. When Patricia's name showed up in the lawsuit as a witness, the hospital's lawyers immediately tried to intimidate her, the same way they had tried to intimidate me. But Patricia was in a much stronger position because she didn't work for them anymore, and they had no leverage over her career. She gave an interview to a local investigative journalist who had been following the case, and in that interview she described in detail what Dr. Voss had said and done the night Emily died, and she showed emails and text messages that proved the hospital had threatened her into silence 7 years ago. The interview went viral, and suddenly the narrative started to shift because people could see that this wasn't just one disgruntled nurse with an axe to grind. This was a pattern of institutional corruption that had been hidden for years. Margaret Holloway released her public statement 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, and it was devastating in its honesty and emotion. She described the night of the accident and the death of her daughter, and she talked about the years of guilt and grief she had suffered, knowing that Emily might have been saved if different decisions had been made. She revealed that she had hired private investigators who had uncovered evidence of altered medical records and witness intimidation, and she announced that she was not only supporting my lawsuit, but was also filing her own wrongful death lawsuit against Dr. Voss and the hospital. She ended her statement by saying that she was donating another $20 million to build a new patient advocacy center at a different hospital, one that would be dedicated to Emily's memory and would help other families navigate the complex medical system and fight back against malpractice. The public pressure on the hospital became immense almost overnight, and their board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss how to handle the crisis. Dr. Voss wanted to fight because he insisted he had done nothing wrong and that his decisions that night had been medically sound. But the hospital's lawyers knew that the altered medical records were going to be almost impossible to explain away, and that a jury would be extremely sympathetic to Margaret and Emily's story. Meanwhile, I was basically living in my apartment and going crazy from the isolation and stress because I couldn't work and I couldn't go anywhere without people recognizing me and either glaring at me like I was a traitor or trying to take my picture. Lisa came over almost every day to check on me and bring me food, and she kept telling me that this was all going to be worth it in the end. But there were moments when I genuinely wasn't sure I believed her. But then something unexpected happened that completely changed the trajectory of the case. Dr. Connor Blake, the arrogant Harvard graduate who had humiliated me and called me an intern, reached out to Rebecca's law firm and said he wanted to speak with them about something he had witnessed. Connor revealed that the hospital had a pattern of bringing in new doctors from prestigious programs and positioning them in key departments right before problem employees were pushed out, because it created the appearance of a normal staffing change rather than retaliation. He said that when he had been offered the position at our hospital, the HR director had specifically mentioned that they were looking to refresh the emergency department and bring in new perspectives, and that they had shown him personnel files of existing staff members who they said were underperforming, and my file had been one of them. The file had been doctored to make me look incompetent and insubordinate, full of fake incident reports and negative performance reviews that I had never actually received. Connor's testimony was incredibly valuable because it showed premeditation and a pattern of behavior by the hospital administration. And when I finally met with him in person at Rebecca's office, he looked me in the eye and apologized sincerely for how he had treated me. And he said that he had gone into medicine to help people and to do the right thing, and that he couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent when he knew something corrupt was happening. With Connor's testimony added to everything else we had, the hospital's position became increasingly untenable, and the media coverage continued to be overwhelmingly negative for them. Local politicians started calling for investigations into the state medical board and how they had failed to catch the altered records, and patient advocacy groups began protesting outside the hospital demanding accountability. The Arizona Medical Association issued a statement saying they were monitoring the situation closely, and several doctors who worked at the hospital started reaching out privately to say they supported what I was doing, even though they couldn't say so publicly without risking their own careers. Rebecca told me that she had received calls from 3 other former employees who claimed they had witnessed similar patterns of decision-making by Dr. Voss, where he prioritized wealthy or connected patients over others. And while those cases couldn't be included in our current lawsuit, they could potentially be used to establish a pattern of behavior if we went to trial. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, when a hospital janitor named Miguel Rodriguez came forward with security footage that he had secretly kept from the night Emily died. Miguel had been working the night shift 7 years ago, and he had been in the hallway outside the trauma bay when Dr. Voss and several administrators had a heated argument about how to handle the situation after Emily's death. Miguel had felt that something was wrong and had made a copy of the security footage from that hallway before the hospital's system automatically deleted it, and he had kept that footage hidden for 7 years because he was afraid of losing his job. But after seeing the news coverage and learning what the case was really about, he couldn't stay silent anymore. The footage showed Dr. Voss clearly saying that they needed to make sure the medical records reflected that Emily's injuries were too severe to save regardless of timing. And it showed one of the administrators responding that they would take care of the documentation and make sure everyone stayed on message. When Rebecca showed me that footage, I actually started crying because it was the smoking gun we needed, the undeniable proof that there had been a deliberate conspiracy to alter records and cover up what had really happened. Rebecca immediately filed a motion to include the video evidence in the case, and within 48 hours, the hospital's lawyers contacted her asking to discuss settlement terms. The tone had completely changed from aggressive defense to damage control, and it was clear that they knew they couldn't win if that video was shown to a jury. The settlement negotiations took 3 weeks, and they were some of the most intense and emotional weeks of my entire life. The hospital initially offered a financial settlement with a gag order that would prevent any of us from ever speaking about the case publicly. But Margaret refused immediately and said that money without accountability was meaningless. She wanted a public admission of wrongdoing. She wanted Dr. Voss's medical license revoked, and she wanted systematic changes to how the hospital handled cases involving VIP patients. Rebecca negotiated brilliantly, using the threat of the security footage and the mounting public pressure to extract concession after concession from the hospital's legal team. The final settlement was announced on a Tuesday morning in a packed courthouse, and it was everything we could have hoped for. The hospital agreed to pay $45 million total, split between Margaret's wrongful death claim and my whistleblower retaliation claim. And more importantly, they issued a public statement admitting that Dr. Voss had made decisions based on factors other than medical necessity, and that the hospital had failed in its duty to provide equal care to all patients. Dr. Voss's medical license was suspended pending a full investigation by the state medical board, and he was terminated from his position at the hospital effective immediately. The hospital also agreed to implement new policies for patient advocacy and to create an independent review board that would investigate any complaints about unequal treatment. I stood next to Margaret on the courthouse steps as she read a statement to the gathered media, and I watched as this woman who had spent 7 years drowning in guilt and grief finally got to say her daughter's name out loud and tell the world what had been done to her. She announced that she was using her portion of the settlement to establish the Emily Holloway Foundation, which would provide free legal assistance to families who suspected medical malpractice, but couldn't afford to fight back against powerful hospitals and doctors. She looked at me and said that none of this would have been possible without my courage and integrity, and that Emily would have been proud to know that her death had led to changes that would protect other patients in the future. The weeks after the settlement were surreal because suddenly I went from being a pariah to being celebrated as a hero, which honestly felt almost as uncomfortable as being vilified had been. I was offered my job back at the hospital with a promotion and a raise, but I declined because I couldn't imagine working in a place that had tried so hard to destroy me, even if the leadership had changed. Instead, I accepted a position as the director of patient advocacy at the new center that Margaret had funded, and I found that I loved the work of helping families navigate the medical system and fight for their rights. Connor Blake ended up leaving medicine altogether and went back to school to become a healthcare policy lawyer, saying that he could do more good trying to change the system than working within it. Patricia Hernandez became the medical director at a community hospital that served underserved populations, and she told me that every day she went to work thinking about Emily and making sure no patient was ever treated as less important than another. The most unexpected miracle came 8 months after the settlement, when I received a call from Margaret asking me to meet her at a construction site on the outskirts of Phoenix. When I arrived, she showed me the plans for a state-of-the-art medical training facility that would be called the Emily Holloway Center for Medical Ethics. And she said that she wanted me to help design the curriculum because she wanted every doctor and nurse who trained there to learn not just medicine, but also moral courage and the importance of speaking up when something was wrong. As we stood there looking at the architectural renderings, Margaret told me something that I would never forget, which was that the day she had been brought back into that hospital and had seen me standing in the chief physician's office, she had felt for the first time in 7 years that maybe Emily's death could mean something, and that maybe there was still a chance for justice in a world that often felt cruel and unfair. I thought about that morning when Connor had called me an intern and humiliated me in front of everyone, and about how I had chosen to stay silent and let my work speak for itself rather than engaging in a shouting match. I thought about how that single moment of restraint had set in motion a chain of events that had exposed corruption, changed policies, and hopefully would save lives in the future. Sometimes justice is delayed, but when it finally arrives, it arrives with a force that can change everything. Emily Holloway didn't get to become the doctor she dreamed of being, but her story became a catalyst for making sure that other patients would be treated with the dignity and care that every human being deserves, regardless of their wealth or status or connections. And that, I realized, was its own kind of miracle. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.